There has been a lot of talk in the past couple of weeks about a peculiar object from Predynastic Egypt that is leading some to reconsider our conceptualization of the trajectory of human technology over time. I looked into it and decided it would be valuable to shed some light on the matter in a concise and factual way. The artifact at the center of this discussion was excavated in the early 1920s from the Badari region of Upper Egypt, an area that would become foundational for our understanding of pre-dynastic Egyptian culture. The excavation was part of the broader Badarian and early Naqada investigations carried out under the intellectual framework of early 20th century archaeology, a period focused on typology, cultural sequences, and broad evolutionary stages rather than fine-grained technological analysis, which at that time was not possible with today's precision. The object came from a burial called Grave 3932 and consisted of a small copper implement with fragments of leather still attached. It was shipped to Britain and eventually deposited in what is now the Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology at Cambridge. There it was catalogued under the number 1924.948A and described as a copper awl with a leather thong. Early archaeologists working in Egypt were categorizing thousands of new objects, often under significant pressure to sort, date, and publish. Copper awls were already well known from pre-dynastic contexts. Leather bindings were not unusual, and the prevailing assumption was that metal tools at this stage were primarily hand-used, simple, and limited in function. No one at the time was asking whether this object rotated, and that's the key point. For nearly a century, the object existed in a state of interpretive dormancy. It was not misidentified in a dramatic way. It was simply understood through the lens available at the time. It sat in a drawer not because it was unimportant, but because it seemed unremarkable. What changed recently was not a new excavation, but a new question. A team led by Martin Adler, working with Jiří Kmošek, re-examined this object as part of a broader research interest in early metallurgy and tool use. Their work was published in the peer-reviewed journal Egypt and the Levant, and it is this publication that sparked the current discussion. What distinguishes their contribution is not that they proposed something sensational, but that they approached the object with a different methodological toolkit. Instead of asking what category the object belonged to, they asked how it had been used. Microscopic use-wear analysis revealed fine parallel striations along the working end, not the random scarring of piercing or scraping, but the signature of sustained rotational motion. The tip was rounded in a way that only repeated drilling produces. These were not ambiguous traces, they were mechanical ones. Then there were the leather remains. Rather than treating them as incidental, the researchers examined their placement and orientation. They were wound spirally around the shaft in a manner consistent with a bowstring wrap. This is exactly how a bow drill operates, linear motion from the bow converted into rapid rotation of the shaft. At that point, the reinterpretation was no longer speculative. The object was doing something different from what it had been assumed to do for 100 years. The metallurgical analysis reinforced this conclusion. Using portable X-ray fluorescence, the team showed that the tool was made from a copper-based alloy containing arsenic and nickel, with traces of lead and silver. This is not trivial. Arsenical copper is harder than pure copper and holds an edge better under stress. Nickel further increases toughness. These are exactly the properties you want in a tool subjected to continuous rotational friction. In other words, the material choice matches the mechanical function, and this is where comparison becomes essential. Around 3300 to 3000 BC, other human groups were certainly drilling holes. In Mesopotamia, stone and copper tools were used for bead production, often with abrasive sands. In the Indus region, early bead drilling traditions were emerging, though their most advanced forms appear later. In Neolithic Europe, bow drills existed primarily with stone or bone bits, not metal ones. Even in the Near East, clear evidence for metal rotary drills at this date is sparse. What makes the Egyptian example stand out is the convergence of three things: a metal drill bit, a mechanically assisted rotational system, and a burial context that suggests the tool belonged to a skilled individual rather than being a one-off experiment. This does not mean that Egypt was uniquely advanced in every domain, but it does mean that pre-dynastic Egyptians were experimenting with mechanical solutions at a level comparable to, and in some cases ahead of, their contemporaries. So why has this reinterpretation caused such a stir? Partly because it forces a chronological adjustment. Mechanically assisted metal drilling now appears securely before the dynastic state. That alone challenges older developmental models. But more importantly, it challenges a conceptual habit. For a long time, we have associated complex tools with complex societies, with administration, complex institutions, and centralized power. This object suggests something else, that technological ingenuity often precedes political complexity rather than following it. This tool was made by someone who understood materials, friction, motion, and durability. Someone who knew that rotation mattered, someone who likely trained others, and someone whose knowledge was good enough to be worth preserving in burial. Finally, it reminds us that archaeology is not only about discovery, but about rediscovery, about returning to old objects with new questions, about recognizing that our narratives are provisional, shaped as much by our assumptions as by our evidence. This small drill does not in and of itself tell us that ancient people possessed lost technologies or mysterious knowledge. It tells us something far more fundamental, that human ingenuity is ancient, practical, and often hiding in plain sight. Sometimes history changes not because we find something new, but because we finally learn how to see what has been there all along.